and the way is clear. There are sensitivities because young people feel they have a right and an entitlement, and that has got to be faced up with. The fact that there were 675,000, that indicates a strong market, and it may be that the music industry, like the newspapers, will have to develop innovative ways to collect revenue from the internet. But if I could very briefly turn to a couple of the other things the Minister said in his speech. He mentioned the question of European patents. That is something that really must be done. I mean, for European patent seekers to have to pay 10 times what they do in the US because of bureaucracy, translations, having to apply in multiple courts, that is complete nonsense. And I've been aware of that for some time because I visited about 18 months, 2 years ago, the Irish community and people who were working with the European Union in Munich. And there are a number of very talented Irish people who are qualified in copyright law and so on, and they were pushing within Europe to get this situation cleared. So we need to do that. With regard to other issues, the question of fair usage, I mean, that is, the Minister raised it, that is a very grey area. I got involved in that with the Joyce estate, and I took the advice of the most prominent lawyer here in Ireland on copyright, and we were able to find our way around it. But I'd have to say this, the government, and I'm not talking of this government, it was a previous government, were not always on the ball as far as these kind of matters were concerned, particularly with regard to literature, because I signalled to a government some years ago when the Joyce situation was coming down the line at us, that we needed to look for a derogation. Other countries did it, because we were moving to a situation from 50 years to 75 years protection of copyright, and that meant the Joyce estate, which is extremely voracious and threatening in this area, moved in and actually inhibited creative artists reinterpreting Joyce. They inhibited scholars quoting from Joyce's books in a spirit that completely defied Joyce's own stated views in the matter. But they got away with it simply because we did not create the exemption as we could have. So this is an increasingly technical area. There are going to be developments all the time, in particularly electronically. And I think we have to be very much on the lookout for these things. Now, I leave it with the Minister. I'll be very interested in reading in the report his response, because I can't stay, unfortunately, to hear it, because there is, as I say, a balancing act. We are the legislature. We are charged with implementing the law. It is clear that there's a defect in the law. This has been drawn to our attention as one of the House of the Oireachtas by the courts. So it is our responsibility to ensure that this deficiency is made up. At the same time, I think we have to be aware of the fact that an entire generation has become accustomed to this. And I believe the music industry also needs to be flexible, needs to be generous. They need to keep their customers with them, or they need at least to help to translate in some way the freeloaders, and we all like to freeload if we can, into customers, but they should not be denied access to the music they love, while at the same time ensuring that the creative artists and the industry get their just and proportionate reward.
I just refer to my own record collection, which I look back on regularly, and the labels include Two Tone, Terry Hooley's Good Vibrations in Belfast, Stiff Records, Mulligan Records. I used to revel in buying albums that didn't come from EMI or Warner or any of the big labels. There was a real antipathy at that stage towards the industry, and I suppose the whole punk movement was intended as a way of showing two fingers to the establishment within the music industry. That's my recollection of my music collection as I was growing up. And I suppose the worst that I indulged in was buying really dodgy reproductions on O'Connell Bridge. In fact, the first time I heard Van Morrison, I could barely hear it, was on a tape I bought there. And that in turn led me to buy almost everything Van Morrison ever did through legal means. So there's always been a cat and mouse game within the music industry between the original recording and how you could get it cheaply or for nothing. There was always historically this kind of attempt to be independent in how music is done and how it's made and how it's distributed. And some of the best and most exciting and most enduring music that I ever heard has come from labels that have long since been bought out or gone to the great rock and roll gig in the sky. But at least there was a basic belief that copyright was important, and a sense that when you weren't buying a copyrighted piece of material, you were at least in a twilight zone, and if you were really honest with yourself, you would acknowledge that you were doing something that was wrong, and that damaged the person who produced the music. One of the albums that I have it's called Ghost Town. It's by the Radiators. I don't know if any of you ever heard it. It's a fantastic classic Irish album. And it is about dismal Dublin, as it would have been around 1980-81 when the recession was really had a hold on us here. And one thing that struck me about this current period is the desperate search that is on, and I think it'll bear fruit, for ways out of this recession. What did we hang on to in the early 80s? I think it was about adding value to our food production. I think it was about financial services. It was about spotting new ways in which Ireland could trade with the world, and new ways in which we could add value to our land resources. And I think we were very clever in some of what we did. Not everything worked, of course, but a lot did. And eventually, once we got our public finances in order at the same time, or around the same time, slightly later, we did actually trade our way out and become a modern economy, and not an agrarian or an economy that was underselling itself in terms of what it produced. I think something similar is going on now, and I think it is around finding the new areas that we will trade successfully in. And in fact, it's ongoing, and it's very hard to say. When the new digital economy began to really work for Ireland, I certainly can't think at the seminal moment. Maybe somebody else will. But it's certainly true that unless we actually get our intellectual property protection right, that the perception will grow that Ireland is not a safe place to develop intellectual property, games, software, music, film, and so on, because of a serious lacuna in our law that would allow, for instance, an employee to walk out of his day job and share a file that it instantly, because things are so fast now, would be around the world, and that removal just simply isn't a sufficient or fast enough response to that kind of action. There is an urgency, and we've all identified it. Senator Cassidy in a particularly passionate way in regards to the AG's advice. There is an immediate need to address this gap, and the judgment that Justice Charlton gave recently really identifies, I think, the serious inadequacies that exist in terms of copyright. I talked about the kind of uneasy relationship between copyright and those who are trying to avoid it in the past, but there's been a huge shift now. It is now the cultural norm not to buy, but to share or to download for free. And the responses from the record industry at times have been ham-fisted, but at times have been very clever too. I'm thinking in particular of the likes of Radiohead offering an album, and you paid what you wanted for it, and it worked. It worked for Radiohead. It doesn't work for most of the smaller bands and artists who are trying to put up intellectual property for sale on the internet now. And I noticed that a lot of the albums that I should declare my own interest here, I work with a lot of young bands, I noticed that they are the free downloaders, they are the file sharers until it comes to releasing their own album. And then they are extremely careful to make sure that the copyright is there writ large on the CD sleeve or whatever it might be, because they understand that they have ownership, they have rights, and they have the right to remuneration for their product, which they've gone to the trouble, expense, and the creative exercise in producing. So there's a huge challenge, a cultural challenge, because there's a huge ambivalence around all of this now. And not only, and in that context, any kind of legal signal can be very damaging or very helpful. And that is why, for instance, the weekend after the Irma UPC decision was given, the message basically went out that this is okay to do, that this is legal. And I understand that there was a significant spike in downloading traffic the weekend after that, when the industry does its measurements. Apparently it does these measurements at a time when young people are most likely to be doing this activity at weekends between specified hours. So they have a fairly accurate metric of traffic. And so the signal that decision gave out, although it was completely inaccurate and at odds with the real substance of what Justice Charlton was saying, the signal was that this is okay, and people responded accordingly. So that needs to change, and the Attorney General's, and Senator Cassidy is correct in this, the Attorney General's advice is urgently needed, really urgently needed, and the statutory instrument that will at least give the state a way of addressing and tackling this issue needs to follow very, very rapidly. It is unfortunate that we're now coming into the part of the year when record sales and so on are most likely to spike, and it's followed by a barren period. But even now, a message from the AG, I think, would be helpful in terms of providing a clear message that illegal downloading is just that, it's illegal, and that people have a right to remuneration for what they are doing, what they are producing. So, I'll conclude, because much of what has been said summarises my own thoughts on the matter. I just want to underline again the urgency of the situation, the need, as Senator Norris has said, for the industry itself to play its part, for it not to use mechanisms that may or may not come to it, and I certainly hope they do, in a heavy-handed way, because the 675,000 people who are engaging in this, by and large, would see this as a normal pattern of behaviour that needs to be challenged, that needs to be stopped, but not through enforcement in each individual case, as I understand it, but through the internet service provider being made on foot of an injunction to remove, to block or divert, which is apparently a much more in the moment response to a situation, illegal traffic of files. I think I'll leave it at that, Minister, but just urging you again that the time is of the essence in all of this, and the message needs to be clear, and the cultural challenge is very significant in it all.
Senator Brendan Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Lasky Herlick, and welcome, Minister. I was briefed yesterday evening by people from the industry in relation to ahead of the debate today, and I have to say there's a lot of merit in what I have to say, and a lot of sympathy for the situation they find themselves in. And in terms of trying to prepare for my contribution today, I thought about, maybe just trying to reflect that situation. But listening to the debate as I was from my room, it seemed to me that argument was being made very well by other senators. But what I'm proposing to do for my contribution today is to read into the record of the House an email I got from a young constituent of mine, so that just there is a view on the record of the House for the purpose of the debate. And the industry people may not thank me for it, but it is just as a contribution so that there's an alternative there to be heard. Dear Senator Ryan, I am writing to you about tomorrow's debate on the protection of intellectual property. It is my experience that debate about the development of intellectual property protections is dominated by a particular way of framing the issue, which is encouraged by powerful lobby groups in the intellectual property industries. For instance, the statements by Minister Ryan following the recent EMI UPC High Court case do not suggest to me that Minister Ryan has available to him anything but industry PR and lobbyists to inform his approach to the phenomenon of online copyright infringement. The arguments that such groups have are by no means meritless, but as a young, informed, regular user of the internet, I am struck by the disparity between the consensus among my representatives in the Oireachtas and the industrial sector and the consensus among my online peers.